This is the fourth video in a series on the implementation of the new liability management framework. The focus of this presentation is the new Directive 88 licensee lifecycle management and the programs that will help to ensure the province's oil and gas industry remains accountable for cleaning up after itself. The presentation will highlight the programs that Directive 88 is bringing into force. Alberta has had a robust economy due to the thriving conventional oil and gas sector. However, the basin has now matured and we have seen declines in producing wells. In addition, closure work has not kept pace with the growth of inactive infrastructure. And the LMR ratio is not a good indicator of the licensee's ability to address end-of-life obligations. The changes in the economy have exposed policy and regulatory gaps in the current liability management framework and highlighted that it was largely reactive when it came to managing companies and their liabilities. Through the 2017 Government of Alberta's Liability Management Review, Indigenous communities and stakeholder groups were invited to provide feedback. To respond to these pressures and considering the feedback received, the government introduced new liability management policy in July of 2020. A reminder of what has occurred to date. The GOA has directed the AER to create new liability management programs based on the policy announced. The new policy introduces 5 components and encompasses the full life cycle of energy development. The first component includes a holistic assessment where the foundational element is the licensee capability assessment. The results from the holistic assessment will apply business intelligence that can be leveraged for decision-making across the life cycle. The second component, the licensee special action, which AER is calling the licensee management program, uses the holistic assessment results to apply appropriate regulatory intervention and actions from education to compliance. These actions encourage licensees to manage and address their liability and regulatory obligations throughout the life cycle. The third component, the inventory reduction program, which includes closure targets for licensees and an opt-in mechanism for landowners to nominate sites for closure. The fourth component, legacy and post-closure, will leverage results from the government panel to consider how to address policy gaps. Finally, the fifth component, expanding the OWA mandate, which allows the OWA to have greater authority over assets and to work with working interest participants to address timely closure. This is a visual representation of the holistic assessment of the licensee supported by the licensee capability assessment. This is a foundational element to how the AER will be able to understand if a licensee is capable and able to meet its regulatory and liability obligations throughout the life cycle. While this assessment was announced through the liability management framework for oil and gas, the intent over time is to apply it across all AER sectors and activities that we regulate. This is a comprehensive and systems-based approach using centralized information and results as indicators for licensee management and for regulatory decisions. The image represents the circular function of how results are used, need to be assessed, and fed back into the holistic assessment. The information needs to be consolidated prior to decisions being made on licensees throughout the entire energy development lifecycle. We know that this will not occur overnight and will take time to fully implement within the organization, and for industry and stakeholders to understand how licensees are managed at each stage of the regulatory process until a closure occurs, including compliance and enforcement actions. Directive 88 introduces the holistic assessment of the licensees across the energy development lifecycle, which includes a multi-factor approach to assess licensees, including Section 4.5 of Directive 67, unreasonable risks, the LCA factors, and any other factors considered appropriate in the circumstance. The directive also introduces new programs such as the licensee management and inventory reduction. This excludes opt-in for now as it is still under development. To align with the new liability management framework, The new directive also addresses changes to our current transfer applications and security collection processes as we move away from the LMR to consider the holistic assessment of licensees. This is where we will focus the discussion today. It is also important to note that the current version of Directive 88 is still being built in phases and will continue to evolve through future releases as we look to fully implement the new liability management framework and replace the LLR program. In this phase, only the elements in Directive 6 that relate to the transfer application process were removed and included in the new Directive 88. The remainder of Directive 6 will be in effect until the next phase of the regulatory changes. As a result of the public feedback received on the Directive 88 on how to use these programs and how they will be implemented and operationalized, a supporting manual for Directive 88 has been developed. The purpose of the holistic licensee assessment is to understand a licensee's capability to meet regulatory and liability obligations throughout the energy development lifecycle to inform our regulatory decisions. Through Directive 88, this new assessment approach will inform the licensee management programs, inventory reduction program, eligibility and transfers, and security decisions. It is a multi-factor approach, which includes the licensee capability assessment, which we will discuss next, Directive 67 unreasonable risk factors, which were revised and published earlier this year, and other factors appropriate in the circumstances. These other factors could include additional information requested related to applications, reporting, and other submissions. This is a shift in the approach to how liability has been managed in the past. We are shifting away from liability management at specific points of time for individual wells, facilities, or pipelines to assessing the licensee as a whole and ensuring liability is monitored and managed throughout the life cycle. In the second phase of implementing the new liability management framework, the LLR program will be replaced and the holistic assessment will be integrated into all other regulatory processes and decisions for oil and gas. The risk group in the LCA assesses a licensee's financial health by evaluating their level of financial distress and the liability risk through the magnitude of the licensee's liability. To determine the level of financial distress, the AAR reviews a company's financial statements to gain insight into its overall financial health and level of distress. The magnitude of liability represents the relative level of monetary consequence should a company not be able to meet its regulatory and liability obligations. All other factors in the LCA are part of the performance group. Unlike the factors in the risk group, factors in the performance group are assessed relative to licensees with similar business type, size, and production portfolio. The performance group factors include remaining lifespan of resources. This evaluates the expected longevity of a licensee's mineral resources and infrastructure, as well as the ability of the current operations to fund required closure activities. The operational factor evaluates a licensee's commitment to safe and responsible operations. Currently, it is measured in terms of regulatory compliance, responsiveness to addressing non-compliances, such as non-compliance follow-up rates, and recent incidents, such as spills and releases. The closure factor looks at recent closure activities and spend, including the pace of the licensee's inactive liability growth. The administrative factors considers a licensee's compliance with AER fees and levies, as well as the status of any outstanding or overdue amounts owed to the Crown for mineral lease expiries. The AER uses peer groups to classify all licensees according to 3 attributes: primary activity type, production level, and primary production type. Peer groups allow the comparison of licensees against other licensees with similar attributes. First, licensees are grouped by their primary business activity. Second, the producer peer groups are further defined by the size of the company based on production levels and their primary production or commodity type. For each individual parameter and for each factor within the performance group, licensees are ranked relative to others in their peer group. Each licensee will fall into one of three tiers. The upper quartile is Tier 1, the middle, Tier 2, or the lower quartile, Tier 3. More information on this can be found in the manual that supports Directive 88. The LCA is used to build an overall licensee profile. All the factors together provide an overall picture of the capability, risk, and performance of a licensee. This slide shows how all the assessments we have described previously are pulled together to provide an overall picture of risk and performance, allowing us to define the characteristics of the licensee. The risk group looks at level of financial distress and estimated magnitude of liability. In this image, the profile is showing low levels of financial distress and medium magnitude of liability. The performance group shows that the company is in the middle of their peer group, with one exception being closure, where they are in a Tier 3, representing the lower quartile for closure. It is in this area that we see potential risk when compared to their peers in addressing their end-of-life obligations. Licensees' profiles will identify and prioritize the AER's effort in mitigating the risks, allowing us to focus on licensees and activities with the greatest impact on liability reduction and to work closely with distressed licensees. A variety of regulatory tools or compliance assurance activities, new and existing, could be used depending on the results of the profile and risks identified. For the time being, we will continue using the Licensee Liability Rating Program and the Liability Management Rating, as described in Directive 6, except for transfers and security collection, as outlined in Directive 88. The LMR will also remain in effect for Directive 1, Directive 11, Directive 24, and Directive 75. The new liability management framework elements, including the holistic licensee assessment, will be used for circumstances outlined in Directive 88. In the new year, our focus will be to fully replace the LLR program with the new liability management framework and further expand the scope of Directive 88. We will rescind and replace Directive 6 and make modifications to other directives impacted by the new framework, including Directive 1, Directive 11, Directive 24, Directive 68, and Directive 75. Further information will be available throughout 2022 for the next phase of work. The inventory reduction program will include both a mandatory and voluntary closure spend target. Closure spend targets will create a minimum obligation for all licensees to abandon, remediate, and reclaim their oil and gas sites. The industry-wide closure spend targets is based on inactive liability and historic closure spending from previous years. The industry-wide targets for the next 5 years are available on the AER website and are updated annually. For 2022, the industry spend target is $422 million. The licensee management program is how the AER will proactively monitor licensees to support responsible management of energy development. Under this program, the results from the holistic licensee assessment will be used to identify those licensees that are or likely to be at risk of not meeting their regulatory and liability obligations. Licensees are encouraged to perform timely closure work and to use available collaborative closure planning tools such as the area-based closure approach to help reduce their overall closure costs and to work more efficiently to reduce liabilities on the landscape. This program may also involve providing education or recommendations to follow industry best practices, and where appropriate, initiate specific regulatory actions when licensees are not willing or able to conduct timely closure work. Under Directive 88, a license transfer application will trigger a holistic assessment of both the transferor and the transferee. The AER will consider the entire application packages of licenses to be transferred. This assessment will include reviewing abandoned, reclaimed, and reclamation exempt sites to ensure they're being held by a responsible party that can address, manage, and monitor current conditions or future issues related to public safety or the environment should they arise. The holistic licensee assessment includes a pre- and post-transfer evaluation of the transferor and transferee. Factors that may trigger further scrutiny of the licensee and application include Directive 67, Section 4.5 unreasonable risk factors, key LCA factors such as financial health, magnitude of liability, and remaining lifespan of resources, and other factors as determined by the AER. More information on this can be found in the manual that supports Directive 88. License statuses that are eligible to be included in a license transfer application are provided in Directive 88. Previously, reclamation certified and reclamation exempt licenses could not be part of the transfer application. This has now changed, and the AER may apply discretion to require licensees to include the transfer of reclamation certified and reclamation exempt licenses. A transfer application will trigger a holistic assessment of the transferor and transferee, which may result in security as a condition of approval. The amount of security required as a result of the transfer application takes into account the licenses transferred and those remaining with the licensee. Security deposits may be requested for either or both the transferor and transferee. Section 1.100 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Rules gives the AER broad authority to require security deposits across the energy development lifecycle. When considering if security deposits are required through Directive 88 and when determining the amount of security, the AER will consider the holistic licensee assessment. As a result of the assessment, the AER will apply further scrutiny on the need for security to offset the risk. A request for refund of security collected under Directive 88 will trigger a holistic assessment of the licensee. If the holistic assessment of the licensee indicates that there is a risk and security is still required to offset the risk, security will not be refunded. If the holistic assessment indicates the risk has been sufficiently reduced, a refund or partial refund of the security may be warranted. With the new liability management framework, the focus is to ensure the province's oil and gas industry remains accountable for cleaning up after itself through timely closure work, which is preferred over securitization. Our next steps include implementation of the new requirements in Directive 88 for the oil and gas sector, as well as starting the next phase for replacing the licensee liability rating and liability management rating. We will continue to further develop the licensee management program and opt-in component under the inventory reduction program to allow nomination of sites for closure. The longer-term goal is the use of the liability management framework in other sectors that the AER regulates. For further information, please visit aer.ca to view Directive 88 and the manual. Also, more information on the programs introduced by Directive 88 is also available on our website. Thank you for your interest in the liability management framework, and please check back frequently to the AER website for new developments.